I'm hoping. Only a few verses here. But before we do that, we're going to do a little review. So if you want to go to Mark chapter 1, if you got your Bibles open, that might be helpful. 2 announcements. Next Sunday night at this time, we're going to have a guest here. His name's Gabe. Gabe is going to be giving us a report about how things are going with the international students as far as the campus ministry goes. And Sunday morning, if you want to hear Gabe preach, he's going to be preaching at our Cocoa campus. So Gabe Ramirez, next Sunday morning over there, Sunday night here, and he'll have that special report. So that's one announcement. The second announcement is we had 2 more people get baptized this afternoon. So that's just, wow, it's just wonderful. I'm so thrilled about that. So let's go ahead and ask God's blessing on our time together tonight, and then we'll get into the gospel work. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for being our Father and allowing us to be part of your family. Thank you for being God and allowing us to know you, revealing yourself to us in so many different ways, specifically through your word. I pray that instead of us bringing our thoughts to your word, we would allow your word to have the effect on us that you intend for it to have, and that we would be good listeners, ears to hear. I also pray that in whatever way we need to amend, change, adjust our lives according to your will, that we would be all over that we would have those kind of eyes and ears that we don't just understand, we don't walk away from the mirror and do nothing about it, but that we make appropriate kind of changes. Because God, we want to make the most of the time that you give us in our lives, but also for the benefit of other people that we come in contact with. So God, I'm asking that you prepare us just a little bit more tonight as we spend time together in your word. Thank you for this opportunity to be together, and thank you for the food that we have in Jesus' name. All right, if you've got your Bibles, here's what I wanted to do. I think we've been far enough in here and taken a long enough time. I want to do kind of just a real quick overview of the first 7 chapters. We're going to finish off the 7th chapter tonight. And when we get to the 8th chapter, I don't know if you remember that long ago, but when we started and looked at this, Gospel of Mark really builds up to chapter 8. And so a lot of groundwork is being laid in the first 7 chapters. That's why I think it's important to kind of get this in the forefront of our mind. So there are people that I have given cards to, so I'm just going to start up here. And if you've got a card, just lift your card up and read it so everybody can see it. What does that card say?
Over the law.
Over the law. Okay, what do I mean by over the law? Doris doesn't have to say it. Anybody can say it. How does that fit with the Gospel of Mark?
The religious guys made.
Okay, especially the oral law, the traditions, the hedges they were building and things like that. Jesus comes along and says, hey, the law comes from me. He doesn't have to submit to the law. The law actually finds its beginning point in God and Jesus. Okay, what other signs do we have over here? Equally God. We see that a lot in Gospel of Mark, don't we? What other sign do we have? What does that mean, over death? If Jesus doesn't want somebody dead, they're not dead. Right? That pretty much proves the power of Jesus. We'll summarize this in a minute. What do we have behind you? Over demons, over demonic forces, yes. Over nature. Calm the storms and things like that, right? What do we have in the back? Over sickness. Yeah, there's not a disease that he can't heal. What do we have over here?
Over Sabbath.
Over the Sabbath. Yeah, he's the Lord of the Sabbath. And he spends some time that. Okay, well, did I miss anybody? Does anybody else have a card? Okay, you've got a job. Well, we're going to spend about the first 15 minutes, we're going to spend the first half of our lesson time tonight doing an overview of the first 7 chapters, right? And as we just kind of get a bird's eye view of what's going on in these 7 chapters, when it's a story that shows that Jesus is superior to the Sabbath, I want you to hold your sign up, right? And you guys close by him, if he misses it, poke him. Okay, all right? And so if it's I don't know, if it's Jairus' daughter, better lift up your sign, right? Over death and things like that. So when there's something that makes these points. So why are we emphasizing this? Because the Gospel of Mark, in large part, in total, it's written to present to us Jesus. But it's written to present to us Jesus because so many people have misconceptions about Jesus. So here's the way God presents his own son to us. In the Gospel of Mark, I'm more and more persuaded that it's not just a presentation of Jesus. It's a presentation of Jesus that you're not apt to see because you've got blinders on. And you need to appreciate that he's greater than what you think. And so Mark flies over a lot of things the other Gospels don't even talk about. But he stops and he hits a lot of major points about how great Jesus is over all these things, right? So if you got your Bibles open, we start with the very first chapter, and we notice in Mark, the first chapter, he doesn't spend a lot of time on Jesus' birth, and he doesn't introduce Jesus the way the other guys do. He simply goes to somebody else. Who does he focus on first in his gospel? I'm not going verse by verse here, but who does he really focus on first? Okay, John the Baptist preparing the way, and he quotes from the Old Testament. When he quotes the Old Testament, he says John the Baptist is preparing the way for... Who's he preparing the way for?
Yahweh.
Thank you. I'm looking for a sign to go up that says, yes, that's it! That's it! Good shot! Do you get the point? Okay. If he's coming to prepare the way for Yahweh, Yahweh's the, remember Exodus 3rd chapter when Moses asked, what's your name? What do I tell people? Here's my name. So he's saying the name of God, the Father, right? He's preparing the way of God. So he's showing to be equally God. Okay, the rest of the first chapter, we've got the ministry of John the Baptist, and then we have Jesus being tested in the wilderness, and then first disciples, the first 4 are chosen, and then we have a couple of examples of Jesus' power, right? He drives out a demon. So in the first chapter, he's driving out demons, and then after it talks about him driving out demons, and it talks about him healing people. Okay, good job. Then Jesus withdraws from the crowds, but then there's a man with leprosy. Yeah. Okay, now this one's a little tricky. Again, I'm probably going too slow for the first chapter. But why is the man with leprosy? Why do I want to see more than one sign? I want to see more than one sign. Jesus is not just over sickness. Well, okay, great. Why did you point to over the law?
Can't touch it.
You're not allowed to touch a leper. So did Jesus sin? No. I'll tell you what the problem is. Our perception, right? If we think Jesus sinned, the problem's with us, not Jesus. He's trying to teach us something about him. Not only can he heal people, but he's the one who defines the law, right? It's impossible for him to be unclean, which, by the way, that was the reason for the law, because you would become unclean if you touch the leper. Okay, so before we leave the first chapter, Jesus can't even go into crowded places anymore because the people are crowding around, right? Okay, chapter 2 starts off with a man who is lame, but they can't get him to Jesus. So what do? People on the video, everybody's motioning to me, so they're really engaged. They're just not saying it out loud. Okay, they have to break a hole in the roof, right? When he sees this guy, where did this take place? This is at Capernaum. That's right. Capernaum is up in the region of Galilee. Mark really focuses on the Galilean ministry, so that's in the north. Okay, so they break a hole in the roof. They lower this man, and everybody there can see that the guy is lame, but Jesus doesn't say, I heal you, get up and pick up your mat. He doesn't say that yet. What does he say to the guy? He says, what? Okay, I'm looking for a sign. Thank you! Only God can forgive sins, right? That's exactly what people are thinking. Only God can forgive sins. And so Jesus says, in order that you might know, Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins. Then he says, yes, you're healed. Take up your mat and walk. And so the man is healed, and everybody praises God because, forgive me if I'm overemphasizing this, but I think this is such a powerful point. Why? Healed him, gives him something you can see, so you can believe in something you cannot see. And what is it that you cannot see? Whether or not his sins are forgiven. But don't stop there. Who alone can forgive sins? God. So what you can't see is if he is really God. It's one of the points being made here, right? Okay, so that's the healing in the first part of the second chapter. Then he calls Levi. What occupation did Levi have?
Tax collector.
Okay, tax collector. What does Levi do for him once he becomes a follower of Christ?
Party.
He has what?
Has a big party.
Yeah, and what kind of people go to the party? Okay, what point was Jesus making when associating with people like that?
He's a physician.
He's not helping the sick. He's helping with the sick.
Okay. The doctor and the sick, and when people would look down on other people, and it was one of the things as far as the oral law was concerned, the superiority of the Jews. Jesus is already attacking that by eating with the friends of the tax collectors. Okay, then there's a question about fasting and the Sabbath. We've got the fasting and the Sabbath. What does he prove about? Okay, great. Definitely over the Sabbath. Jesus many times will heal people on the Sabbath or cast out demons on the Sabbath, right? To make a double point. Try to teach people what the Sabbath was really for, and that he's Lord over the Sabbath, as well as his being supernatural, right? Okay, so he answers the question about fasting with the Sabbath. Third chapter, chapter 3. Jesus again in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Who's in the synagogue on the Sabbath day? It's going to be a Sabbath day issue. What's going on? Remember this, beginning of the third chapter?
Money changers. Money changers.
Okay. There's a man there that he sees, and this man has the shriveled hand. Remember this? And Jesus sees the man, and he purposefully points him out and has him stand up on the Sabbath day. So before he does any healing, what's he doing? Okay, healing in just a minute.
Wrong.
He doesn't just heal a man on the Sabbath day. First of all, he puts it to the people. Why is he putting it to the people?
So you good or evil on the Sabbath?
Yeah, that's the question he asked. And how did the people respond to that? Yeah, good. You guys did perfect. That's exactly what they did. They wouldn't respond, right? And so Jesus uses a very interesting word here about Jesus getting upset by this. Then he goes ahead and he heals the man on the Sabbath day. The crowds are following Jesus. Then we've got the rest of the apostles. Then his family, his physical family, comes to collect Jesus. Why? Okay, the family starts off by saying he's not in his right mind. We need to kind of do what do they call that thing where your family swoops in and says, we love you so much, we can't let you
Intervention.
Intervention, okay. Family intervention time. They want to take Jesus, but they can't even get to Jesus because the people are there. Now, the enemies of Jesus, the religious leaders, isn't that sad to say religious leaders are the enemy? Are going to seize this opportunity. This is really interesting because the religious leaders have brought up this idea before. It's the first major time we see it in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3 here. But they're going to use Jesus' own physical family as an opportunity to bring this up. What's this? Well, that's right. He's not in his right mind. Why? Because he's being controlled by somebody else. He's able to do what he's doing by the power of demonic forces. Right? And so Jesus doesn't let that one go. You know, a lot of times you just live a life that proves people wrong, but every now and then you got to stop and you got to answer. And Jesus stops and answers, and he reasons with the crowds why this cannot be true. Jesus is not casting out demons by the prince of demons. He's casting out demons because, yeah, that's exactly right, to show he is superior and against. He came to destroy the power of the evil one. So that's almost all the third chapter, but at the very end of the third chapter, they tell him, hey, by the way, your family's looking for you. And Jesus makes a point about that. Remember what that point is? I'll tell you who my family is. Who's my family?
He doesn't dwell thy father's house.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's those, here are my mother, my brothers, whoever does God's will is my brother and sister. That's the conclusion of the third chapter. Okay, fourth chapter. Fourth chapter is a lot of teaching. A lot of teaching. And Jesus' style of teaching, what is his number one method of teaching? Parables. And his disciples ask him why. And before we get to the answer, tell me, why are the disciples asking why? Why did disciples come up to him and say, why are you teaching in parables? They didn't, by the way, they didn't come up and say, man, really like your parables. Great job. That's not what they said. They said,
We don't understand it.
yeah, could you make this a little more plain? Why are you always, why the ambiguity, right? Why talking in stories like this so that people can understand? So Jesus' response, Jesus' answer. Which prophet does he quote? He quotes Isaiah. That's exactly right. And he quotes that passage. We usually refer to it as Isaiah's call. But the idea is the message is going to get out and give people an opportunity, but most people are not going to listen. And that is Jesus' major point. I'm teaching in such a way that the people who really want to find out, they're going to find out. Right over in the Gospel of Matthew, he's going to use that expression, knock, the door will be open to you, seek, you will find. Really illustrates that point. Parables for us, because, we've got all this history with it, they're easy to understand. But the first time you heard that, not easy to understand unless you really tried to find out. The people who really tried to find out, who came back to ask Jesus, Jesus would explain it to them. So a lot of teaching in parables through most of the fourth chapter. But after that teaching, Mark is not, we don't find big passages like in Matthew and Luke. You're going to find a lot of teaching. Mark doesn't do that very often. And even in the fourth chapter, where there's one of the biggest chunks of teaching you're going to find, he doesn't end with that. Mark has them out on a stormy sea. Remember, Jesus had gone up to pray in the mountains, and he sees his disciples out there No, I'm getting my stories confused. That's in the 6th chapter. Let me back up here. In this chapter, Jesus is already on the boat with them, right? And the storm's going on, but he's asleep. He's asleep. And so they wake him up because they're scared to death. And what does Jesus do? Calls the story, and how do they respond? Yeah. By the way, the over nature guy did raise that. Yeah. Shows his power over nature, and the disciples, what do? Who is this man? Okay, they've already seen him cast out demons, heal the sick, make a point that he's over the Sabbath, right? They've heard all this teaching and stuff, but still they're shocked to see his power over nature. That's the end of the 4th chapter. 5th chapter. Mark goes into more detail than anybody else in telling this story, which is really unusual because Mark's usually so brief, right? Mark tells the story of the guy who has the legion of demons in the area of the Gadarenes, over demonic forces. Okay, we already remember that story, has the back and forth, cast the demons. Where did the demons go? Okay, where do the pigs go? And when everybody sees the power, right, over demonic forces, showing himself to be God, right? What do the people do?
Leave.
Please leave. Yeah, I'm glad you guys are shaking your heads because it's kind of like, wow, he proves himself to be obviously supernatural, probably God. Look at all this power. And instead of, wow, we got questions for you. Wow, tell us all these things. It makes me think that maybe because my devotional reading recently has been in the Gospel of John. But when Jesus went to Samaria and they hear about all these miracles that the miraculous knowledge that God has, right? Because when he's talking to the woman at the well, the Samaritans come out, what do they say? Please stay with us. Tell us. But these people in the area of the Gadarenes, it's kind of like they see the power of God as God go away. Maybe it's light shining on darkness. It exposes things that need to change, and maybe you're not willing to change. Maybe, hey, we just lost 2,000 pigs. What else are we going to lose if... by the way, did you lose anything this past week? Sorry. There are some sacrifices that God's people have to make. So here's the story of the man with the demons cast out. Then after that, Mark goes to Jairus. Who's Jairus?
Synagogue. Leader, synagogue.
Okay. He's the one whose daughter is sick. We're a 12-year-old, remember this? Where she's going to die. So again, over sickness, but does she die? Yeah. And he has to bring her back to life. Only 3 of the apostles get to witness this. And the parents, who are the 3 apostles. Yeah, the inner 3. This is one of those cases where they're the only ones who witness. What happens on the way to raising her back to life? What happens on the way to the daughter Jairus' house? Yeah, the woman, yeah. By the way, very important story, but the woman touches the hem of his garment, and Jesus stops everything. Who touched me? And the disciples are obviously frustrated. What do you mean, who touched you? Everybody's touching you. You hear a crowd of people surrounding you. But Jesus is trying to put a spotlight on somebody, not to make them feel bad, but to clarify, right? To help them better understand who he really is. And so the woman is commended for her faith. And then we end up at Jairus' house. Now, 6th chapter. Chapter 6, Jesus comes back to his hometown. How's he received in his hometown? Yeah, this is the 2nd time back in his hometown. Neither prophet's not without honor except in his own hometown. And that's especially true in Jesus' hometown. So that sets it up so Jesus can send out his disciples. Right? So Jesus sends out the disciples, and it's kind of like he's preparing them. Then in the middle of that story, Mark gives us the story about John the Baptist and how he died. Right? Herod beheading him. After the story of John the Baptist, they come back and report how they were able to cast out demons, how it was a good missions trip, so to speak, the apostles. Then we conclude the 6th chapter. The last major story here would be the feeding of the 5,000. If you include we got the feeding of the 5,000 and then Jesus walking on the water. Feeding of the 5,000 is important because we're going to get to the feeding of the 4,000 here in the 8th chapter, in the next chapter. So we're going to repeat this, right? What does it show when Jesus feeds 5,000? I'm going to go with the nature thing again, because usually 5 pizzas will not feed 5,000 people, right? 5 loaves, 2 fish. And how much do they have left over? 12 baskets full. The feeding of the 4,000, how much do they have left over? 7 large baskets. Uses a different word for that with the feeding of the 4,000. Now, this is the one at the end of the 7th chapter. I'm sorry, at the end of the 6th chapter, after the feeding of the 5,000, this is the one where Jesus had gone to pray. He sees the disciples straining at the oars during the turbulent water down there on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus comes down, and it says in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus went to them, intending to pass them by. What's the significance of that? Yeah, how in the, I'm just picking on you tonight, I'm so sorry. But how in the world does that show that he's equal with God? Okay, well, he's walking on water. That's a supernatural thing. But do you remember that expression? What's that expression? If you're walking to somebody, it's kind of like, I'm going to come to you so I can walk right by you. That doesn't make sense, does it? But coming to somebody, what is this walking by? Passing by. What's the Greek translation of the Old Testament called? Septuagint. Okay. Now, what were you going to say before I interrupted you? Yes, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. When you get that story of Moses, when Moses wants to see the glory of God, he tells him, "You can't see the glory of God, or you'll die." Right. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of the rock, and I'm going to. That's right. Uses the same expression that Mark uses here in the Gospel. Right? So Moses seeing the glory of God, it's like his disciples get to see the glory of God. Here's another demonstration of that when Jesus walks on water. Beginning of the 7th chapter, the first part of the 7th chapter, Jesus deals with the law, the oral law. Why do we keep calling it the oral law? Yeah, it was handed down, you spoke it. All these laws, and they had a bunch of these laws, right? They memorized them all. They weren't written down yet. It wasn't till like the 2nd century until they wrote them down. And why did they have to write them down? Because this new young generation just can't remember it all anymore. Right? So it's kind of like wasn't it the Masoretic period where the Jews were so upset because nobody could remember all the vows anymore. So now we're going to have to write the vows in there, right? Because people just don't know the way. Okay, so we call it the oral law. What we mean by that is the law that was taught by the religious leaders of Jesus' day, which Jesus said contradicts this. Jesus is over the law. And one of the points he makes is, number one, is hypocrisy. You're not really concerned about pleasing God. You're trying to look good. Number two, you're more concerned with your law than you are God's law. Okay, it was washing of hands. That's what it started off with. But do you remember the example he gave of your law being superior to God's law because it actually makes you violate God's law? Remember what that one was?
Honor your mother and father, Corbin.
Corbin, yeah. You violate what law of God's? Honor your father and mother. You don't even honor your father and mother anymore because you're keeping your law prevents you from doing something that God said. If you find yourself in a situation where you say, well, I can't tell the truth. Hey, there's a problem here, and the problem's not telling the truth, right? You put yourself in a situation, and that's exactly what the Jews did. So we start the 7th chapter with Jesus making the point, you're not ceremonially unclean by food, right? So he's dealing with what makes you right. It's not what you eat, it's what comes out of the heart, right? Now he's going to deal with what they considered unclean people. I've only left myself 5 minutes, but it's an easy story to read because Jesus is going to the Tyre and Sidon. That'd be, if you get the map in your mind, you've got in the south, you got Judea, then you got Samaria in the middle, then up around the Sea of Galilee. That's the area of Galilee, right? But if you look towards the Mediterranean Sea, which would be to the west, up there on the coast, we call it the Syro-Phoenician coast. That's where Tyre and Sidon would be. Jesus is going up there. He rose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Why did he go there? He entered the house, didn't want anybody to know it. Why wouldn't want anybody to know it? Yet it could not be hidden. Has Jesus demonstrated this before, that there's times to get away from time? Jesus usually gets away from prayer, right? So time to get away, that's what's going on here. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Heard of him, even amongst the Gentiles, his reputation preceded him, right? Now the woman was a Gentile, Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast a demon out of her daughter. But he said to her, let the children be fed first. It's not right to take the children's bread and to throw it to the dogs. Okay, you get this, don't you? Who's the dog in this story? And so the Syrophoenician woman stood up and folded her arms across her chest and said, who are you calling a dog? It's not what she did. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. It makes me think of a passage that's going to be part of the questions tonight. Because our attitude sometimes is, isn't God supposed to do good stuff for me? Hey, wait a minute. He's God. Who are we to tell him what to do, even when it doesn't seem like it's something good for us? It's ultimately always good for us because God's God and he knows best. But you know what? On the surface sometimes, God's opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the low. I tell you what, this is a humble woman. This is a great example. She's kind of like, call me a dog? I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. She answered him, yes, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And he said to her, for this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. And she went home and she found the child lying in bed and the demon was gone. He returned to the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. So he's traveling across the northern region there. And they brought him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hands. I know I've got the last couple minutes here. But do you have a different translation for speech impediment? This is a word, this is the only time it's used in the New Testament. The only other place we find it is in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And the place it's found in the Septuagint is in the book of Isaiah. In fact, I do. Isaiah chapter 35, where it says, the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. This is the only other place in the Greek language that this word is used, and it's talking about the Messiah who's coming. Don't you think Mark chose that word on purpose? Because they have perfectly good words. He does this a lot that if you're reading in the original language, it's like, wow. And there's one more at the end of this 7th chapter that he gives us. Let's come back to Mark chapter 7, the last few verses here. Taking him aside from the crowd, this man who he can't hear, and because of that, he doesn't speak well. That's a speech impediment, right? Pulled him away from the crowd, puts his fingers into his ear, spitting, touched his tongue. All this stuff, by the way, you're not supposed to do. But he does this to show that he's over, thank you, he's over the law, and as God, he can do whatever he wants to do. It says in verse 34, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, which is be open. Mark's translating this for the benefit of his non-Jewish readers, right? Who wouldn't understand what this means. So he's translating for it, be open, and his ears were open, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Now notice how the people respond to this. Jesus charged them to tell no one. Have we heard that before in the Gospel of Mark? His time had not yet come, right? Too many people know too quickly. Jesus is more than happy for everybody to know someday. Someday you're going to take the bushel off the candle and put it out there for everybody to see. Right? Ministry of Jesus. But not yet. Not yet. His time has not yet come. So he charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Okay, I told you that other word for the speech impediment was only used once in the New Testament, once in the Old Testament. This word, astonished, is not used anywhere else in any Greek literature. It is a once and done word. So the only way we can figure out this word is to pull it apart. And it's a compound word in Greek language, and it literally means super, over, wonderful, great. So it's one of these words. I used to have a professor. His name was Professor McGee, Albert McGee. He gets so worked up. I love teachers who get so worked up, by the way, sorry. But he gets so worked up, he'd make up words. And it was kind of like, wow, that must be a really good point, because he made that word up. He used to keep track of some of the words that he made up. But sometimes you get really excited. Well, sometimes you need a new word, right? It just doesn't describe how wonderful it is. What's the point Mark's making? This is the impact Jesus is having. Who's he having this impact on? Gentiles. I thought Jesus was just coming to the Jews. I thought it was only the children. Yeah, but you know what? There's going to come a time when the early church needs to hear, this message isn't just for you. It's for everybody. Are there people that, I'll go ahead and tell you. I'm going to give you some questions in a minute. As a preacher, I can't tell you the number of times that I've had people come up to me and say, why do we need to support missions? There's enough people here in the United States who haven't heard about Jesus. You know what? I agree with that. People in the United States here need to hear about Jesus. But everybody on the planet needs to hear about Jesus. And if we wait till we're done here, guess what? We'll never get the message out there. Everybody needs to hear this, right? Okay, so here are your questions for tonight. Which, by the way, do you have any questions for me? Okay, well, here are your questions for tonight. Sorry. Here are the questions for the group tonight. The emphasis on the Gentiles, what we talked about at the end of the 7th chapter here. How Jesus dealt with this woman. I'd really like you to read this passage, because it's not just this woman. These verses, I think, some very important teaching about our attitude, about our relationship with God. And why is it important to see Jesus as good? This is that word that they use. He does all things well. They are above and beyond amazed because they saw Jesus. So if you want to join Dennis, Willie, Greg's group, Nate's group, all you guys, if you want to join an existing group next door, please feel free to do that. If you want to be part of the newer group out here, as I understand it, it's pretty much a guys group. If you want to be part of the guys group in the foyer area, they're open to anybody, but you can stay there. If you're just here for the Bible study, thank you for being part of that tonight.